Hey friends, welcome back to the Irony Shelf. Tonight, we continue Volume 2 with The Stalled Ox by Saki. Edwardian society perfected the manicured estate, entirely forgetting that nature has an exceptional sense of comedic timing. Now pour yourself a rosemary-infused gin and tonic and meet the Pastoral Invader. Listen closely to the rhythmic, solitary scrape of a palette knife, mixing raw sienna on a porcelain slab. It is the late autumn of 1913, and while the hills outside are swept with damp grey and fading amber, this high-ceilinged studio remains a refuge against the November chill. Within this stiff, undisturbed stillness, broken only by the soft scratch of a brush against linen, a gentleman may spend a lifetime painting the exact same pair of cows under a walnut tree, entirely convinced that the rest of the world will remain politely outside his gate. But this stately comfort belongs to a fleeting era of velvet waistcoats and social success. Just past the studio door, where the gravel path curves toward the high boxwood hedges, the crisp autumn breeze carries a sharper truth, one that smells of damp soil, crushed wild clover, and the raw, heavy musk of the countryside. Here, at the very edge of this cloistered world, the silence is about to be tested, not by a demanding art critic or a polite collector, but by a sudden, unceremonious intrusion, with little regard for the delicate sensibilities of a landscape painter. And so, dear listener, we begin our story. Theophil Eshley was an artist by profession and a cattle painter by force of environment. Let's not suppose that he lived on a ranch or a dairy farm in an atmosphere permeated with horn and hoof, milking stool, and branding iron. His home was in a park-like, villa-dotted district that only just escaped the stigma of being suburban. One side of his garden bordered a small, picturesque meadow, in which an enterprising neighbour pastured some small, picturesque cows of the Channel Island persuasion. At noon in the summer, the cows stood knee-deep in tall meadow grass under the shade of a group of walnut trees, with the sunlight falling in dappled patches on their sleek, velvety coats. Eshley had envisioned and painted a dainty picture of two peaceful dairy cows in a setting of walnut trees, meadow grass, and filtered sunbeams, and the Royal Academy had duly displayed it on the walls of its summer exhibition. The Royal Academy encourages orderly, methodical habits in its children. Eshley had painted a successful and acceptable picture of cattle drowsing picturesquely under walnut trees, and having found his niche down that path, he was forced to stay on it. His painting, titled Noontide Peace, a study of two greyish-brown cows under a walnut tree, was followed by A Midday Sanctuary, a study of a walnut tree, with two greyish-brown cows under it. In due succession there came Where the Biting Flies Cease from Troubling, The Haven of the Herd, and A Dream in Dairyland. All were studies of walnut trees and greyish-brown cows. His only two attempts to break away from his established tradition were complete failures. Turtle doves alarmed by a sparrow-hawk and wolves on the Roman countryside came back to his studio in the guise of monstrous heresies, and Eshley climbed back into grace and the public gaze with A Shaded Nook where drowsy milkers dream. On a fine afternoon in late autumn, he was putting some finishing touches to a study of meadow weeds when his neighbour, Adela Pingsford, pounded on the outer door of his studio with loud, urgent knocking. "There is an ox in my garden," she announced, which explained her tempestuous intrusion. He stared at her. "An ox," said Eshley blankly, and added rather foolishly, "What kind of ox?" "Oh, I don't know what kind," snapped the lady. "A common, everyday or garden ox, to use the expression. It is the garden part of it that I object to. My garden has just been put in order for the winter, and an ox roaming about in it won't improve matters. Besides, the chrysanthemums are just coming into flower." "How did it get into the garden?" asked Eshley. "I imagine it came in by the gate," said the lady impatiently. "It couldn't have climbed the walls. And I don't suppose anyone dropped it from an aeroplane as a beef advertisement. The immediately important question is not how it got in, but how to get it out." "Won't it go?" said Eshley. "If it was inclined to go," said Adela Pingsford, rather angrily, "I should not have come here to chat with you about it. I'm practically all alone. The housemaid is having her afternoon out, and the cook is lying down with a severe headache. Anything that I may have learned at school, or in later life, about how to remove a large ox from a small garden seems to have completely escaped my memory. All I could think of was that you were a near neighbour and a cattle painter, presumably more or less familiar with the subjects that you painted, and that you might be of some slight assistance. Possibly I was mistaken." "I paint dairy cows, certainly," admitted Eshley, "but I cannot claim to have had any experience in rounding up stray oxen. I've seen it done in moving pictures, of course, but there were always horses and lots of other equipment. Besides, one never knows how much of those pictures are faked." To this Adela Pingsford said nothing, but led the way to her garden. It was normally a fair-sized garden, but it looked small in comparison with the ox. A huge spotted brute, dull red about the head and shoulders, passing to dirty white on the flanks and hindquarters, with shaggy ears and large bloodshot eyes. It bore about as much resemblance to the dainty pasture heifers that Eshley was accustomed to paint as a fierce barbarian chieftain would to a dainty geisha girl. Eshley stood next to the gate while he studied the animal's appearance and demeanour. Adela Pingsford continued to say nothing. "It's eating a chrysanthemum," remarked Eshley at last, when the silence had become unbearable. "How observant you are," said Adela bitterly. "You seem to notice everything. As a matter of fact, it presently has 6 chrysanthemums in its mouth." The necessity for doing something was becoming urgent. Eshley took a step or two in the direction of the animal, clapped his hands, and made noises of the shoo variety. If the ox heard them, it gave no outward indication of the fact. "If any hens should ever stray into my garden," said Adela, "I should certainly send for you to frighten them out. You shoo beautifully. Meanwhile, do you mind trying to drive that ox away? That is a rare Madame André Blusset chrysanthemum that he's begun on now," she added in icy calm, as a glowing orange head was crushed into the huge munching mouth. "Since you have been so open about the variety of the flower," said Eshley, "I don't mind telling you that this is an Ayrshire ox." The icy calm broke down. Adela Pingsford used colourful language that sent the artist instinctively a few feet closer to the ox. He picked up a garden stake and flung it with some force against the animal's spotted flanks. The operation of mashing the rare chrysanthemum into a petal salad was suspended for a long moment, while the ox gazed, with concentrated inquiry, at the stick-thrower. Adela gazed with equal concentration and more obvious hostility at the same focus. As the beast neither lowered its head nor stamped its feet, Eshley ventured on another feat of marksmanship, with another garden stake. The ox seemed to realize it was time to go. It gave a hurried final pluck at the bed where the chrysanthemums had been, and strode swiftly up the garden. Eshley ran to steer it toward the gate, but only succeeded in quickening its pace from a walk to a lumbering trot. With an air of inquiry, but with no real hesitation, it crossed the tiny strip of turf that the charitable called the croquet lawn, and pushed its way through the open French doors into the morning room. Some chrysanthemums and other autumn flowers stood about the room in vases, and the animal resumed its browsing operations. Still, Eshley fancied that the beginnings of a hunted look had come into the animal's eyes, a look that demanded respect. He discontinued his attempt to interfere with its choice of surroundings. "Mr. Eshley," said Adela in a shaking voice, "I asked you to drive that beast out of my garden, but I did not ask you to drive it into my house. If I must have it anywhere on the premises, I prefer the garden to the morning room." "Herding cattle is not one of my qualifications," replied Eshley blandly. "If I remember, I told you so earlier." "I quite agree," retorted the lady. "Painting pretty pictures of pretty little cows is what you're best for. Perhaps you'd like to do a nice sketch of that ox making itself at home in my morning room." By this time, even the mild-mannered artist had reached his limit. Eshley began striding away. "Where are you going?" screamed Adela. "To fetch tools," was the answer. "Tools? I won't let you use a lasso. The room will be wrecked if there's a struggle." But the artist marched out of the garden. Several minutes later he returned, laden with an easel, sketching stool, and painting materials. "Do you mean to say that you're going to sit quietly down and paint that brute while it's destroying my morning room?" gasped Adela. "It was your suggestion," said Eshley indifferently, setting his canvas in position. "I forbid it. I absolutely forbid it," stormed Adela. "I don't see what standing you have in the matter," replied the artist. "You can hardly pretend that it's your ox, even by adoption." "You seem to forget that it's in my morning room, eating my flowers," came the raging retort. "You seem to forget that the cook has a severe headache," said Eshley in his mild manner. "She may be just dozing off into a merciful sleep, and your commotion will waken her. Consideration for others should be the guiding principle of people in our station of life." "The man is mad!" exclaimed Adela tragically. A moment later, Adela herself appeared to go mad. The ox had finished the flowers in the vases, along with the book cover of Israel Kalish, and seemed to be contemplating an exit from its rather restricted quarters. Eshley noticed its restlessness and promptly flung it some bunches of Virginia creeper leaves as an incentive to prolong the sitting. "I forget how the proverb runs," he observed. "Something about better a dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox in a place filled with hate. We seem to have all the ingredients for the proverb ready to hand. I shall go to the public library and get them to telephone for the police," announced Adela, and, fuming loudly, she departed. Some minutes later, the ox, awakening probably to the suspicion that oil cake and chopped mangolds were waiting for it in some stone byre, stepped with much precaution out of the morning room, stared with solemn inquiry at the no longer hostile human, and then lumbered heavily but swiftly out of the garden. Eshley packed up his tools and followed the animal's example, leaving the Larkdene estate to the cook and her headache. The episode was the turning point in Eshley's artistic career. His remarkable picture, Ox in a Morning Room, Late Autumn, was a sensation and immediate success at the next Paris Salon. When it was subsequently exhibited in Munich, it was bought by the Bavarian government over the fierce bidding of 3 meat extract firms. From that moment, his success was fully assured, and the Royal Academy was thankful, 2 years later, to give a conspicuous position on its walls to his large canvas, Barbary Apes Wrecking a Boudoir. Eshley presented Adela Pinksford with a new copy of Israel Kalish and several finely flowering Madame André Blusset plants, but nothing in the nature of a real reconciliation has ever taken place between them. And here we conclude our reading of The Stalled Ox, written by Saki, and respectfully adapted for the modern listener. This tale stood as a defining work from Hector Hugh Munro, the man better known to history as Saki, and illustrated his position as a premier satirist of his day. While others painted idealized versions of the English countryside, the author focused on the humorous collision between refined aestheticism and raw reality. He wrote as a farewell to the Victorian certainties of his youth, using his wit to remind us that life is rarely as tidy as a painting. He delighted in celebrating the unexpected, deploying a biting, observant eye to unearth humor in the rigid absurdities of Edwardian life, ultimately showing the beast inside the parlor. In many ways, this story closely mirrors the author's own literary life. In the character of Theophil Eshley, a man trapped painting the exact same pair of cows over and over again to satisfy an insatiable public, we find a sharp critique of the constraints placed upon Saki. The Edwardian society demanded a tireless, predictable wit, yet his own final choices revealed a man intent on trading the comfortable artifice of the drawing room for a much harsher reality. This fierce commitment to the real over the theatrical was best expressed in his final act. At 43 years old, well beyond the precincts of conscription for the Great War, as World War I was then known, he refused a commission as an officer and insisted on enlisting as a private in the 22nd Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. He famously preferred the reality of the trenches to the safety of a desk job, reportedly saying, "I have always looked forward to the romance of a soldier's life." First published by the Morning Post on November 12, 1913, as seen here, a mere handful of months before the onset of the conflict, this tale was subsequently anchored in Saki's 1914 collection, Beasts and Super Beasts. The piece captures the final, blissful, and utterly trivial peak of Edwardian society. For an audience untroubled by the larger world and consumed by the opulence of winter house parties. The narrative exposed just how fragile their manicured decorum truly was. In these pages, Saki's signature style sharpens noticeably. He sets aside the light, gossipy cynicism of his earlier works to reveal a realm where the unruly realities of nature effortlessly trample the domestic peace. Here we shall leave Theophil Eshley and the remnants of Adela's morning room to posterity. If you too find a certain charm in the art of the ironic and the unexpected, we invite you to subscribe and join us. It is your support that allows the Irony Shelf to regularly curate these volumes. Thank you for listening. I look forward to sharing our next story with you very soon.